Working Cows Podcast, episode 283. This episode's brought to you by Understanding Ag.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. This is Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, recorded exclusively in the C90 Ocean Minerals Studios. Very excited to be joined once again today by Gabe Brown and Dr. Alan Williams. We are going to continue our conversation with them about the principles that they see a need to have covered in the podcasting space. And today specifically, we're going to talk to them about the 6 principles of soil health, the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship, and the 4 ecosystem processes. I'm very excited for this conversation, very excited for this partnership, and we'll jump right in. So, Gabe, Alan, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast. Welcome back.
Thanks, Clay. Great to be with you today.
Yeah, thank you.
So one of the ways that, I think one of the great services, and as I understand it, Understanding Ag has done for American agriculture is adding the 6th principle of soil health, or maybe it's the first one, depending on who's counting, but that principle of context. As I understand it, context deals with what's been done to that land in the past before you got there. What is your context as far as family? And whenever I talk about this context piece, I always say, is it better for your land to move 4 times a day? Maybe. Is it better for your family to move 4 times a day? If you've got young kids, probably not. So there's your context, right? And then what's the context? Are you in Arizona or are you in Florida? Because those are 2 wildly different contexts. And so is that an accurate understanding of some of what goes into context when you're talking about it?
Yeah, certainly. Context really is all enveloping and all encompassing. But so yes, it is, the history of the land as you know it, but it also involves what we call the historical ecological perspective. So we like to go back and, when that land was much more controlled by nature, what happened there? What were the species? What was the abundance? What was the type of productivity that you might have seen there? Certainly, it is the production and financial and economic goals, of the farm, of the ranch. It involves the family dynamics, employee dynamics. All of those are integral as a part of this context. Succession plan is actually a part of that context. The agricultural enterprises that you are focused on is a part of that context. So again, it is all encompassing, but it's absolutely critical that you as the farmer or rancher understand your own context. And then anybody that's going to work with you, they need to understand your context too, because frankly, as a consultant, as somebody selling you something or promoting something, if they do not ask you enough questions to fully understand your context, you don't need to walk away from them. You need to run away from them because they don't have your best interest at heart.
And so today, that is our goal, is to talk about the 6 principles of soil health, the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship, and the 4 ecosystem processes. So what are they, and why should a farmer know about them and consider them?
So Gabe, why don't you take the 6 principles, I'll do the 3 rules, and then we'll finish up with the 4 ecosystem processes.
Sure. So one of the joys of being able to travel all over the world and be on so many different farms and ranches and orchards and vineyards and everything else is that no matter where I go, no matter where our Understanding Ag team travels, the 6 principles of soil health, the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship, and the 4 ecosystem processes are constant. So the 6 principles of soil health, briefly. Number 1 is context. And each and every one of us, as was just said, has a different context. We need to understand our context and realize that it's different. Context between neighbors can be different. How many children do you have in the family? How many are actively involved in the farm or ranch? What's your financial context? What's your historical ecological context? Context comes into play in everything we do. What is the team that's involved in your operation and helping you? All of those things are part of your context. The second principle is least amount of mechanical, chemical disturbance possible. And I tell people, I always defer back to nature, to God's principles. You know, was there disturbance prior to mankind? Sure, there was. There's earthworms and burrowing animals. There's typhoons and tidal waves and all this, hurricanes. That's going to cause some type of disturbance. But it's not this copious amounts of tillage that we do in agriculture today. Now, it's not only mechanical disturbance, it can be chemical disturbance also. So by chemical disturbance, that's more or less inputs that you're putting in, synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and fungicides, and they can be organic amendments also. Too many people think, I'm applying for instance, feedlot manure. That's not the same. Well, no, it's not the same as synthetic fertilizer, but it can have negative consequences. We need to be aware of that. The third principle is armor on the soil. And just as our skin protects our bodies, the armor or the residue on the soil protects that soil. Walk into a healthy pasture ecosystem. Walk into a forest. How much bare soil do you see? It should be the goal of every farmer, rancher, gardener out there to not allow one to see bare soil on their operation. If we see bare soil, that soil is prone to wind erosion. It's prone to water erosion. Moisture is going to evaporate away. We're not providing the home and habitat for biology. We need to keep that soil covered. The fourth principle is that of diversity. And I can't overstate the importance of diversity. I'm kind of a history buff, and in reading Lewis and Clark's journals, you'll find they documented hundreds of different plant species on their travels. Walk onto most farms and ranches today. How many plant species do you see? And it's not only diversity of plant species, animals, insects, all of these play a critical role in a healthy ecosystem. The next principle is living root in the soil as long as possible throughout the year. Now, obviously, a very diverse perennial system will have a living root for the longest time. As Alan said in our first podcast, most cash crops that are grown today have a living root maybe in 90 to 150 days at the most. 2/3 of the year, there's no living root capturing that solar energy, taking that solar energy, using part of those compounds for growth, transferring the rest into the soil where it can be cycled. We have to collect as much solar energy as possible for as long a time throughout the year. Where I live here in south central North Dakota, we get our last killing frost about May 15th each year, and the first one in the fall about the 10th to 15th of September. I used to think that those 110 to 120 days were my growing season. But then when I walk out into some of my pastures, I can see crocuses starting to poke through the snow in early March. We can easily have growing plants photosynthesizing in November and December. In fact, if you even dig under the snow, you will still find some green plants. They're actively shedding carbon compounds to feed biology. We often don't think about that in our farming and ranching practices today. And the final principle is that of livestock, and I would add insect integration. Ecosystems are not healthy if we don't have animal and insect integration on land-based ecosystems. Plain and simple. We can advance soil health on strictly cropped ground without integrating animals, but it'll never be as healthy as it could be if we integrated those animal and insect species.
So I got a couple of follow-up questions there. First of all, as an anecdote from my own place, the east end of my place was probably hayed every year since the first double 9 mower showed up, and the west end of my place was hayed less frequently, but sometimes. Right? It was all pretty much all of it you could hay. As I've implemented these practices and started to pay attention to these 6 principles of soil health, I've watched the west end of my place recover a lot faster than the east end of my place. And the main reason for that, in my mind, is the lack of bare ground on the west end of my place, because we hadn't been exporting those nutrients all the time, pulling the hay off and never putting it back out. And so is that kind of how you see that working? Is that, it's got the armor on the soil, so it was a lot faster to regenerate than the east end.
Right. And with any of these principles, first of all, Clay, I'm really glad you're observant and that you've been following that. But with any of these principles, you have to be intentional. You have to understand that every single thing, we do is going to have multiple effects. And Ellen will talk more about that. But by removing all that biomass, what's protecting that soil? How do we expect those soil temperatures to be optimum for biology? And so that moisture will not evaporate away. It all starts, like we talked about in our earlier podcast, that we have to build that home and habitat for the soil biology. We can't remove the roof off their house, so to speak, and expect that biology to live and thrive.
Yeah. So then my next question, following up on the 6 principles of soil health, is when you talk about them, I mean, you rattled them off in a specific order. Are they ranked in your mind? Is it this one's the most neglected, or is it just this is how I remembered it this time?
Well, I don't think you can really put an area of importance that one's more important than the other. In saying that, for each individual out there, farmer, rancher, gardener, I would rank context as the most important, because we each have our own separate context, and the principles, rules, and processes, those are going to be the same, but the context part of it is specific to us, and our family at our location. So I would put that one above the others as far as importance, but they're all interactive. And if you only do one or two, you're not going to be successful in regenerating your landscape.
Yeah, that's what I've noticed as I've started to pay attention, is you can't really take one away. One of the consultants that I've watched before has a great illustration, and he basically made a child's mobile, what I'm talking about, a mobile, and you pull on one of those things and it rattles everything that's connected to it. And so that's the way I see these principles of soil health working, is that you've got to have them all, or you're going to be limited as far as what you're able to achieve. So we'll obviously, these are going to remain connected throughout the rest of this episode, but we'll move on from that to the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship and the 4 ecosystem processes, and we'll continue to draw these 6 principles back in as we go, I would imagine. So,
yeah. So the 3 rules are the rule of compounding, the rule of diversity, and the rule of disruption. So the rule of compounding is this: there never are any singular effects. Everything that we do, every management decision we make or don't make, everything we buy and apply, everything we buy and feed or apply to our livestock, all of that creates a whole series of compounding, cascading effects. And these effects are never neutral. They go one way or the other. They're either positive or they're negative. Okay. And there is no in between. So, for instance, if we use an anthelmintic, a dewormer, are we killing just worms inside the gut of our livestock? Nope, we're not. It is not just target organism specific. So that dewormer passes through the animal into its manure, and it can harm dung beetles, earthworms, other beetles, other life outside of the body of that animal. And that is exactly what has happened. Okay. So that's an example of a compounding cascading effect. And this holds true, again, across all spectrums of everything that we do. So what we have to do, and what I do every day, is I question, okay, when I make this decision and I do this, what kind of compounding effects is that going to create for me? Are they going to be positive? Are they going to be negative? If they're going to be negative, then I don't want to do that. Okay. So the goal here is let's start stringing together decisions and management practices that are going to result in day after day compounding, cascading effects that are quite positive. And this builds upon itself over time to where if we're also combining that with intentional application of the 6 principles, we will see profoundly positive results. The second principle or rule, of adaptive stewardship is the rule of diversity. Now, that was also a principle, right? Diversity was also a principle. So that's how important diversity is. It's in the principles and it's in the rules. And it means the same thing. We want diversity, and this is not just diversity in plant species, but we want diversity in microbial species in the soil and beneficial insects, birds, wildlife, and in our crops and livestock species. So as much diversity as we can possibly manage, because that diversity in and of itself works with the rule of compounding. Diversity creates very positive compounding, cascading effects. And then the third rule is the rule of disruption. Now, this is critically important in making progress. And I like to give an analogy to help people understand the rule of disruption. So if you're an athlete and you want to continue to make progress, and let's say you want to be a world-class athlete, you want to compete for championships or compete in the Olympics. Well, every athlete knows that if they do the same exercise routine at the same duration and intensity, day after day, month after month, year after year, they're going to hit a wall. And they're going to hit that wall sooner rather than later, beyond which they're not going to be able to progress because they're doing the same thing over and over again. And not only are they going to hit that wall, but then they're actually going to start going backwards. They can no longer maintain even the same level of athletic performance. So every athlete inherently knows that to continue to make progress, they've got to disrupt, alter that exercise routine on a routine basis. They've got to continuously challenge their body and their mind to make progress. Well, if we're biology and we benefit from this rule of disruption in building our bodies and our minds, why do we think the biology on our farms and our ranches doesn't respond the same way? It absolutely does. So we have this whole array, both in cropping systems and in grazing systems, that are called planned purposeful disruptions that we can introduce to be able to make ongoing continuous progress. And that's what it's about. However, here's what we have to be careful about. We cannot, just like you can't cherry pick a principle and do just those one or two principles and think you're going to make ongoing progress, neither can you cherry pick a disruption and just keep repeating that disruption. Now it's no longer a disruption, it is a prescription. And prescriptions never work long term. Okay. So let me give you a handful of examples of grazing disruptions, and then we can give a handful of examples of cropping disruptions. So if we're thinking about grazing, disruptions include things like altering my stock density per acre impact. I call that pulsing of stock density. So if I've been going normally at 40 to 50,000 pounds per acre, I want to think about a magnitude difference. So I want to jump it up to maybe 200,000, 500,000 pounds per acre. Okay. So altering stock density. Another one is altering rest periods after a grazing event. So instead of coming back every 30 to 40 days, I want to give an extra long rest to a paddock. So that's a planned purposeful disruption. Another is altering my rotational pattern across my farm or ranch. If every spring it's spring green up, I start in pasture A and I go A, B, C, D, and E and back to A and just keep repeating that, I'm going to hit a wall. Okay, I'm going to stop making progress. So next spring, I'm going to start in pasture C or D. Okay, or even reverse the rotation. And this is a major problem, by the way, that we have on our public grazing lands, our BLM and U.S. Forest permitted lands. They are highly prescriptive. You're doing the same darn thing all the time, the same rotational pattern, the same date on, the same date off, on and on and on. And that is creating a declining asset, a declining ecosystem. And even their own data shows that. Okay. So even on our public lands, we need planned purposeful disruptions to continue to make progress. Another one is altering paddock configuration. Even with the same total pounds of livestock and the same acres contained in a paddock, the shape of that paddock is going to make a major difference in the actual ending impact of that grazing event. If I make a longer, more narrow paddock, for example, I'm going to get a lot more trample effect in a graze. I'm going to get a lot more biological shedding on an even mature bait or even consistent basis, and a lot more manure and urine applied on an even consistent basis versus a square paddock. Okay, the animals move differently in a square paddock versus a long, narrow paddock. Alter direction of the paddock is another disruption. If I'm been routinely or historically orienting my paddocks north to south, change them to east to west next year. Believe it or not, that can make a radical difference. Alter grazing height on and off. Alter species order. So if you're a multi-species producer like I am and Gabe is, then alter the order of those livestock species from time to time. Leader follower can be another one. Bale grazing is another one. Planned burns can be another one. But again, don't cherry pick any one of these disruptions and then say, I'm going to do that one all the time. That is a core mistake. So if we think about cropping systems, okay, a handful of disruptions that we can introduce there. And I'm thinking about if you've been very conventional in your cropping system, right? So if you're a corn and soybean farmer, introducing another 1, 2, or 3 cash crop species in that rotation is a disruption. Altering your tillage practice is a disruption. Introducing cover crops is a disruption. Altering or integrating livestock onto the cover crops, or as we've talked about before, putting livestock onto crop residue, corn stalks, corn residue, that type of thing is a disruption. So there's a whole host of different types of disruptions that we can introduce there as well. And what we have found is that if we use this rule of disruption very judiciously and we use it intentionally, then that allows us to make ongoing, year after year, incremental progress. We never hit the wall, so to speak. So those are the 3 rules.
Very good. I appreciate that. So to me, the 3 rules really comes down to an issue of humility. We talked about that in the earlier podcast of hubris, the hubris of agriculture, to think that we can control and predict all the outcomes and all those things. And when we start to talk about the need for diversity, especially, and the rule of compounding, those things scream humility to me. Like, I'm just going to assume that this ecosystem is way too complex for me to really get my head all the way around it, and I'm going to do what I know is best without going out and purchasing an input, especially chemical and mechanical inputs. I'm going to do what I know is best without those things if I can avoid it. Would that be kind of how you understand those as well?
Absolutely. And the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship are uniquely understanding acts. But they come out of decades of our hard-earned experience. So as we got to sharing related experiences and talking about the things that we observed and noted through the years that really worked, we basically boiled it all down to these 3 rules. And again, just as the 6 principles apply, Gabe said it, they apply anywhere we've ever been, doesn't matter the country, the state, the climate, the agricultural enterprise, they work equally well. The same thing applies to the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship. It doesn't matter where you're at, what your enterprises are, what your climate is. These 3 rules apply equally well.
Yeah. And then the last thing that I had there as far as follow-up was concerned is how, especially with the rule of disruption. I mean, you listed off a lot of different opportunities for disruption. How do I decide? Like, how does a person go about deciding this year which disruption are we going to use, or which set of disruptions are we going to use?
That is an absolutely outstanding question. And the short answer to that is Gabe mentioned it on the earlier podcast, the need for education. You can't adequately implement what you do not know, right? So there is a large need for an education here. Once you get this education, whether it's coming to a Soil Health Academy, another one of our workshops, or whatever, get the education and we even have online courses like Regen Ag 101 and our Adaptive Grazing online course. And we'll be releasing a cropping online course as well. But, those are all very helpful in helping you to begin to understand what disruptions to apply and when. Typically, for somebody that's just starting, 2 of the most critical disruptions early on are extended rest and recovery and altering of stock density. Okay. So if you just start with those 2 things, you're going to make a major difference initially, and then you can start folding the others in. And honestly, I make them now based on my daily observations and what I'm seeing. And it becomes almost intuitive which disruption you need at any given point in time if you're really spending the time to observe. Now, here's the other point about the rule of disruption. I gave you a lot of singular disruptions, right? But the rule of disruption also applies in the rule of compound. And here's how. So I can take multiple disruptions and combine them into the same disruptive event. For instance, I can alter my stock density, alter my paddock configuration, and alter my rest period, all in the same disruptive event. Yeah, so now I'm applying the rule of compounding here because I'm combining multiple disruptions into the same ongoing event so that I get even quicker progress than I would have with an individual disruption. Mm-hmm. Gabe, anything to add to that?
You nailed that.
I think that one question I have is, like, my plan this year is to run cows and sheep together. Is it, do people not do that just because of the logistics and the labor side of that? Or is there a reason I shouldn't do that?
Oh, I love to run sheep and cattle together. First of all, they're dead end hosts to each other's primary parasites, right? So why in the world would you not do that, or at least in a leader follower type situation? Because take advantage of that, that they're dead end host. So secondly, they eat differently, they graze differently. So I get a much more even grazing impact when I have sheep and cattle together. Third, they have a different biological and hoof impact. Their hooves are shaped differently in different sizes. So they have a different impact on the soil. They send a different signal to the plants as they're eating those plants. So you stimulate even more microbial species reactions in the soil and response, and you get even more nutrient cycling occurring for you here. And the other benefits that we get is that the microbial shedding, from the manure, urine, from their coats, their saliva, all of that, as we combine them. And what I have found is that our sheep pretty quickly bond to the cattle. And when we make the move, typically the cattle start to move first, and the sheep are watching them. And then the sheep just follow. Okay. So when the cows move, the sheep move with them because they want to stay with them. And it's a lot easier because the sheep want to stay with the cattle to use a single strand of polywire, in those paddocks, and keep the sheep, maybe you have one or two go up underneath the polywire, but so what? They're flocking animals, herding animals. So they're going to come back under it again, to be with everybody. So we don't even worry about that. So those are, some of the distinct advantages that we get from running them together. And the other big one is you reduce your labor requirements.
Right. And I think it's probably a stockmanship issue as much as anything. Like if you've got content animals, you're not having to worry about something getting trampled and a lot of those things too. So I think that there's others. Yeah. So obviously a lot of different directions we could go here, and a lot of things that we could cover as far as the three rules. But for now, let's move on to these 4 ecosystem processes. What are they, and how are we managing them?
Right. And I'll just name them all, and then we'll go back and Alan and I'll discuss them. So the 4 ecosystem processes are the energy cycle, the water cycle, the nutrient cycle, and community dynamics, or we sometimes refer to it as biodiversity. And these are constant. We're applying the principles and the rules to drive the processes. So think about this. The first one is energy cycle. What do we mean by that? Well, that's simply how much solar energy, in other words, sunshine, can we collect? And this plays in, of course, to biodiversity on our farm, species diversity. Do we have biodiversity of plants? So we have as much different leaf sizes and shapes as we can. The way I like to explain this to people is how much sunlight is hitting the soil surface on your farm or ranch. Our goal should be none. It should be intercepted by a living plant, leaf, okay? because what happens then, that sunlight, of course, is collected. And we all learned back in grade school about photosynthesis and how plants take those carbon compounds and combine with water, and it uses all of that to part for growth, and part of those carbon compounds it exudes into the soil to feed soil biology. And where it is, I hate the term sequestered, but it's put into that carbon cycle. And of course, it's those carbon compounds that feed the biology in the soil. Well, it's that biology then that drive the nutrient cycle, like we talked about. It's the biology in the case of mycorrhizal fungi that secrete glomalin, that build the aggregates. And a lot of farmers and ranchers don't realize that a soil aggregate will only last about 4 weeks. And then microbiology consumes the glues that hold that aggregate together, and you need to build new ones. It just amazes me how many farmers think, oh, I've got to go do some deep ripping or some tillage because my ground is hard, it's compacted. Well, it's compacted because you haven't allowed it to build any soil aggregates. And without the soil aggregates, you're not going to infiltrate any water. And so all these things are tying together. We've got the energy cycle, the water cycle, and the small water cycle, which is land-based water, accounts for 40+% of the water we receive on our farm or ranch. We tend to create our own droughts. We're finding, Clay, in larger landscape areas when we're working with several farms and ranches in close proximity, we can start positively affecting that water cycle. Moisture attracts moisture is the old adage, and then of course, all these are tied to the community dynamics, the biodiversity. So these 4 ecosystem processes, as a farmer or rancher, if we focus on these, we're going to increase profitability. We're going to improve resilience, and that farm's going to be there for the next generation to make a living off of. Alan, do you want to expand on those?
Well, when you talk about capturing the energy from the sun, photosynthetic capture, we have way too much wasted sunlight in today's agriculture, too much, I call it photosynthetic leakage. Okay, sunlight hitting the ground without being intercepted by a plant solar panel, the leaf of the plant. That is another reason for diversity, because if I have a monoculture growing out there in any field, it's unavoidable. I'm going to have some photosynthetic leakage, wasted sunlight. Where I have diversity, particularly where I have multiple stories of plants growing there, a low, intermediate, and higher story, and then I have plants with many different leaf shapes, leaf architecture, it's much harder to have photosynthetic leakage, because as that sunlight goes down through that canopy, then the different leaf architectures and the different plant stories are going to capture it at some point. And think about that. That is our principal energy source, period. And if we're wasting it, then that is causing negative, again, back to the rule of compounding, okay? It's causing negative compounding effects. So, but the reverse of that, the more we capture, the more positive compounding and cascading effects are occurring. If a plant is intercepting more sunlight, every plant in that whole array of plants in a field is now producing a lot more root exudates, feeding a lot more microbes and a lot more species of microbes. And they are then producing biotic glues that is aggregating the soil for us, infiltrating water and oxygen. They are grabbing nutrients out of the soil and feeding those nutrients to the plants. They are producing enzymes that are breaking the bonds and bound nutrients in the soil and making them available for plant uptake. I mean, on and on and on the cycle goes, and if there's one thing that is probably the worst thing that we're doing today in modern agriculture, that is this failure to capture sunlight adequately.
Mm-hmm. And to me, they're related, right? We're slowing down the sunlight. We're slowing down the water. I haven't had enough time to ruminate on what we're slowing down with regard to the nutrient cycle and the biodiversity, but you got to slow down the sunlight and slow down the water, because that water hits the bare ground too fast. We've all heard about the capping of the soil that happens when a raindrop hits bare ground and all those things. So if we can slow that down and get it to infiltrate, then we're doing a better thing as far as those things are concerned. So and again, one thing that I think we should not move on before we touch on is the fact that diversity came up in all three of these, the 6, the 3, and the 4. Diversity, and how much of American agriculture is monocrop. Even the cattle ranch, the place that's only doing beef cattle, is only doing beef cattle. And so there's opportunity for increased diversity there too. And so I think that's something that we should definitely call attention to.
Yep. And I would add that we have monoculture income in much of agriculture today because of that. We limit the resiliency of an operation. We're actually limiting the ability to transfer that opportunity to the next generation. And think of it this way, Clay, you're Western South Dakota, large landscape. How many head of sheep could a lot of those ranchers add without doing any much extra? It added a little bit to labor, but think of the economic gain. Think of the benefits to the ecosystem. I just look opportunity, when the team goes out and consults on a farm or ranch, one of the things we look for is what we call the low-hanging fruit. Where can they get the biggest bang for their efforts, so to speak? And I agree with Alan. It's the leakage of solar energy and the ability to stack enterprises. And we often hear that, I can't do that, it's too much work. Well, not really.
Yeah. Sage Askin told me one time, he said, I think the average 300 cow ranch could sell 100 cows, bring in 1,000 sheep and a herder, and you haven't really updated, you might have more paperwork to do now with the herder, but you haven't really upped your labor at all. They're going to do most of the labor on that deal. There will be a few days a year that you've got to show up and help with, docking or whatever it is, but there's that was kind of one of my many red pill moments on the Working Cows podcast is, that changes the way I look at the world. Yeah. Is these get rid of 100 cows, bring in 1,000 sheep, and that would be, I'd say, conservative. If you've got a herder with them, you could, there's a big opportunity there that's missed, and it's an opportunity to introduce diversity.
There's a reason they were called the mortgage lifters.
That's right. And Clay, let's look at, so what is one of the major issues going on right now in livestock agriculture? It is HPAI in poultry, highly pathogenic avian influenza, right? Well, let's parse this apart and let's present the facts, okay? So the vast majority of poultry enterprises in North America are what kind of enterprise? They are a monoculture system enterprise, and they are all confined. They're all indoors in a semi-climate controlled system, right? Well, 99% plus of all the cases, whenever, and I get these news threads every day. Okay, so I'm seeing this every day, wherever they're finding a new infected flock, 99% plus of the time. Where is it? What is it? It is a commercial flock, okay, that are completely enclosed. So they're in a complete monoculture system, even more of a monoculture system than a cornfield or bean field. Okay, I would contend, because they don't have anything from the outside interacting with it, like at least a cornfield and soybean field can have something else interacting with it, right? But these birds confined inside of these houses don't. So that has created birds that are much more susceptible to HPAI. And when you hear about, okay, what is transmitting, what is carrying, what are the vectors for HPAI? Well, wild birds, particularly wild waterfowl. Well, I don't remember the last time I saw a flock of ducks or geese flying through a commercial broiler house or commercial layer house, right? Or even wandering around in them. So
that's an invasive species. We got to get rid of that.
Right. So how in the world is this transmitted from the ducks and the geese, inside the houses to where the chickens are, and why are they so susceptible? Okay. It's in the wild birds, but yet they've been able to develop immunity. Okay, immunity to it. Do you have some die? Of course you do, just like with any other disease. But they're able to develop an immunity. But what are we doing? Okay, the moment you have a bird test positive in a flock, you kill the whole flock. So now what you have done is, instead of reducing the incidence of the disease and reducing susceptibility, you have dramatically increased susceptibility to the disease, because you are not allowing any resistance to develop in those birds. So again, monoculture systems, whether crop or livestock, actually foster, facilitate, and encourage disease.
It seems like everybody's got a definition for regenerative agriculture, and I would imagine that the 6, 3, and 4 are a big part of your definition for what regenerative agriculture is. But let's talk about that. What is the definition of regenerative agriculture? Whose is correct and why?
Yeah. So, understanding ag, this is our definition when we're asked, what is regenerative agriculture? And it's simply this: farming and ranching in synchrony with nature to repair, rebuild, revitalize, and restore ecosystem function, starting with all life in the soil, moving to all life above the soil. And we came up with that because, we saw many, many different definitions, and we didn't think they were all encompassing. And this comes back to essentially the creation and how ecosystems function, and it encompasses all. It's simple, we think fairly clear.
Yeah, and worthy of probably a whole episode of its own. So
probably
there's a lot there. Very, very good. I appreciate that. So then what role or why was the 6, the 3, and the 4 developed, and what are the importance of those ideas?
Well, that comes back to the farming and ranching in synchrony with nature and repair, rebuild, revitalize, and restore. How do you do that? Now, obviously, you can't undo everything that's been done. For instance, here, Alan and I and Shane this past October traveled over to England and Ireland and spent a couple weeks, and it was just eerily similar to the production we see in the United States. But one major difference that we saw over there was the lack of insect life. And along with that, the lack of birds. And they're, of course, closely tied together. But There was a study that was released a few years ago that showed over the past 25 years in Germany, they had lost 75% of their diversity of insect life. I mean, that's just alarming. And so some of those things you can't bring back. But what we understood is that we can significantly, and I might say rather quickly, start moving farmers, ranchers on the right path to regenerate their ecosystems. And that is applying the 6 principles and the 3 rules to drive those 4 ecosystem processes. And as Alan said earlier, it works anywhere in the world where there's land-based ecosystems.
Yep. And am I right in saying you mentioned that the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship? I'll get my mouth around that eventually, but you mentioned earlier that the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship are uniquely understanding ag's creation. Am I right in saying also that the 6th principle or the first principle, depending on who's listing it, of context, was that one that you guys added as well?
It is, and we're not taking credit. There was many people who, Alan Savory, of course, started talking about the 4 ecosystem processes, and through holistic management, those are widely known, widely accepted. The 5 principles came about over the past 25 years, I would say, from a variety of different sources, NRCS included in there. Our former partner who retired, Ray Archuleta, was one of the first to start talking about context and that we have to add context. And yes, Understanding Ag added that principle because we realized just how important it was and it was missing. Now we're pretty satisfied with these.
Yeah, no, I think it's very good. We've talked about kind of what they are. We've talked about some of the ways that we can implement them. But what are some of the other? Are there other implementation strategies that you would like to share here regarding these 6, 3, and 4, or have we covered those?
And I will start with that and then pass it on to Alan. Where to start? We often get asked, Clay, and that's where it really becomes important to be a good observer and to understand that individual farmer or farm family, understand their context. I tell people my financial context today is a lot different than it was in the 90s when I went through those 4 years of hail and drought. Okay. Today, it's much easier financially for me to adopt a new practice, so to speak. That has to be taken into account. There seems to be this misnomer out there that if you move down the regenerative path, there's going to be this loss of yield, loss of pounds, and there's this time period you have to go through before you reach profitability. Fact of the matter is, nothing could be further from the truth. And we worked with many, many clients over large acreages in many different types of agriculture. And by starting with their context, where's the low-hanging fruit? Listen to them. We're able to significantly improve profitability while advancing ecosystem function very quickly. But they have to be intentional. They have to want to make this change. Henry Ford said it best, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're correct. Well, it's kind of that way as you move down the regenerative path. I've heard many people say, oh, I tried cover crops. They didn't work. Cover crops work. Cover crops rarely fail. People just fail to plan. Were you planting the right species? Did you pay attention to herbicide carryover? What was your resource concern? Were you using the right species? You have to plan accordingly and then move forward.
I caught the gleam in Alan's voice when he said that we've come up with these through hard-fought observation. And I think that the way I took what he said there is that we've learned some painful and expensive lessons over our years of farming and ranching. And so that's kind of how we came up with these things. And so I think that's an important thing to recognize, is that we're giving people the opportunity to learn from your mistakes too. They don't have to go out and make their own expensive, painful mistakes. They can learn and get farther down from a better starting place. Would you agree with that?
That is exactly correct. That's probably one of the key things we actually bring to the table, to be honest with you, in our consulting, is that we can keep people from making what I call the common mistakes, the mistakes that people just seem to repeat over and over again, when they're first getting into something. And because we've already made them, been there, done that. We know how to avoid them. And everybody that we work with actually makes much faster initial progress than any of us did. It took us years to get to where we can get most of our clients in just 2 or 3 years now. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Clay, can I give an example of a common mistake?
Please.
So in working with clients, one of those common mistakes is, let's plant a monoculture alfalfa field for hay production. Okay. In an earlier podcast, I talked about carbon-nitrogen ratios. Soil is 1 part nitrogen, 11 parts carbon. You're adding a monoculture legume, in the case of alfalfa, and the same can be said about planting soybeans, planting peas, any type of legume. You are putting too much nitrogen into the system. That biology is going to readily consume that nitrogen, but to balance its needs, it's going to have to consume more carbon. Pretty soon, it eats all the residue on the soil surface. You're haying off a lot of the biomass, so there isn't much residue up there. Then it starts eating any dying, decaying roots there might be. Then it goes after the organic matter in the soil. Then it goes after the compounds, the glues that are holding soil aggregates together. Pretty soon, what you have is a very collapsed soil structure that can't infiltrate water. And you start losing the productivity of the alfalfa, and then you say, I need to go tear this up. I've compacted. We got to rip it and kill it and, restore it. Well, you've destroyed that. And then Alan could go on for an extended period of time about the negative compounding effects, cascading effects of feeding that monoculture alfalfa. That's just as bad. So,
the illustration that comes to my mind when you talk about a collapsing soil structure, and God be with the people who have recently experienced the earthquake in Turkey and in other places. But it kind of, we talk about plated soil, right? But that illustration doesn't really click with me. But maybe the illustration of a high-rise apartment, like when we've got well-functioning soil, we've got all these layers of a high-rise apartment, and there's room for all of these organisms to live. And then when we ignore the 6, the 3, and the 4, we come through and basically we collapse that soil structure so that there's no place for those microorganisms to live in that high-rise apartment of our soil. Is that a accurate illustration?
That's exactly right. I can't tell you, Alan, how many times have you had somebody say to you, but you don't understand, my soils aren't like that? Well, I'm sorry, all soils are made up of sand, silt, clay, biology, and various fractions thereof. Okay? So don't tell me that your soils have to be like that. That's a direct reflection of your management. We have seen over and over again, as we move farmers and ranchers down this path, they can go have very degraded soils that are pale in color, lack the aggregation in the pore spaces, and within 3 years, you wouldn't even think it was the same soil. It's become dark, it's well aggregated, there's life in the soils. It's a direct reflection. If they want to see what the problem is, they just need to go look in the mirror.
There's a very good quote, Clay, that I use quite often from W.C. Loudermilk that says, "The land does not lie. It bears a record of what men write on it, a record that is easy to read by those who understand the simple language of the land." And Gabe is absolutely correct. A farmer or rancher cannot lie to us. Within 10 minutes of stepping foot on their place, we know how they've really been managing. And especially once we stick a shovel in the ground and we look underneath the surface of that soil, we know exactly how they have been managing, and even for decades, because that record is there, that decades-long record. So, it's very evident. And yeah, as Gabe said, you've got to, I can't tell you how many alfalfa pivots I've been on. Almost every single one of them. The soil is heavily compacted and plated, and their infiltration rates have declined significantly. That system in the soil has collapsed.
Yep. If I may, Clay, just to give the listeners an example. So a couple of years ago, I was on a very large Western U.S. ranch, and the owner wanted me to be there. The general manager of the ranch did not want me to be there. And he took me out to the pastures, and these pastures were literally 95+% bare soil, very, very capped soils. The soils were literally white. And he stuck a spade in the ground and said, "Look at this. Don't tell me that you can change this." He said, "This is what I have to work with." I simply took that spade and moved less than 2 feet to where there was a plant growing, dug that up right next to that plant, and it was dark, well-aggregated soils. And I said, I held the 2 clumps there, and I said, "Well, the answer is pretty obvious, isn't it?" He did not like that answer. But the fact of the matter is, he wasn't applying the principles and the rules to drive the processes. Plain and simple.
And I think that takes us to the power and the necessity of observation. And I think that we could dive off into a really deep rabbit hole about what we should be looking for, but I think that there's probably a better context for that as far as an educational platform where people could actually look at it with their own eyes and feel it with their own hands and smell it with their own nose. But let's talk about the importance of and some of the valuable tools for observation. What are some of the indispensable tools of observation that we should be regularly using, and when should we be employing them? Like what seasons, or maybe once a season, or how often? What are some of the tools, and how often should we be employing these tools of observation?
Well, first, our eyes. Just looking around, taking the time to observe. And unfortunately, way too many farmers and ranchers aren't taking time to truly observe anymore. We've got our butt parked in the seat of a tractor, a combine, a sprayer, a pickup truck, a buggy, whatever, and we're just driving along. We're cutting hay, we're baling hay, we're planting crops, whatever in the heck we're doing. And we're not really paying attention. We're probably playing on our iPhones or, whatever. And so we need to take the time to truly, truly observe yet again. So that's first and foremost. Secondly, listen. What do you hear? Do I hear birds? Do I hear insects? Or do I hear silence? What do I hear when I'm out there? Then aromas matter. Okay. In nature, if things smell bad, it typically means things aren't going very well. But if things smell very pleasant, that typically means things are going quite well. And then some tools that we can use in that observation process. A shovel, we like to use, whether you call it a spade, a sharpshooter, or whatever. But that's what we like to use. We carry one with us at all times. One stays in my pickup truck. We keep them in our buggies, and the shovel can tell us a ton. It is absolutely amazing how many farms, how many ranches we go on that no one has ever done that with the farmer, with the rancher before. not all the consultants, the crop consultants, the extension people, everybody else, they haven't come and stuck a shovel in just a simple shovel test, and with that shovel test, we can determine, the degree of carbon in our soil to an extent from a visual standpoint. How deep is the darker carbon layer? How deep does it penetrate from the surface of the soil down into that soil profile? How many different color variations or degradations do we have in that profile? How deep are our roots? What is our root biomass? What direction are our roots growing in? Okay, what about the level of aggregation? Do we have any aggregates? Do we have crusting on the soil surface? Do I have micro aggregates? Do I have macro aggregates? How deep does that aggregate layer go? What is the evidence of biology in the soil? Do I see earthworms in the soil and evidence of earthworms and evidence of other insect, beetle activity and things like that? What is the aroma of my soil? That teaches us a lot about the microbial status in that soil. So the simple shovel test can tell us so very, very much. And then a single ring infiltrometer, do a water infiltration test. A thermometer, and we like to use the thermal thermometers, point and shoot, but a thermometer, just walking around and pointing it, at the soil surface, what's my temperature? That teaches us a ton. And then a refractometer to be able to measure Brix level, whether it's in my forages, in my crops, whatever the case may be. But what is the Brix content in those? So those tools, once again, just simply the power of observation, the shovel, an infiltration rate, a thermometer, and a refractometer. So 5 different things that we can utilize, and we can utilize every day to be able to clearly and fully define what's going on, and even to track and monitor our progress.
And I think
I would just add to that, play a couple of examples here of that. So for 20 plus years, we had an internship program on our ranch, and we got new interns every summer. And one of the first things I did with them, one of the first days, is I gave them a notebook and a pencil. I took away their cell phones and their headsets, and I set them out in the paddocks with the livestock for 4 hours at a time. And I told them, you write down everything you observe. And then I do that exercise with them again near the end of their stay with us. It's amazing how well they developed a sense of observation in that time period. And so often that's what we need to do. We need to observe. Now, with that shovel, one of the best things that we could do when we go on a new farm or ranch is we simply asked the producer, well, where's your better soils? And most farmers, ranchers know where their better soils are. We go dig a spadeful there. Then we go over to the fence line or an undisturbed area, and dig a shovelful there and compare the two. And their mouths usually drop open because that really shows them, even though they don't want to admit it, there is a big difference.
Yeah, that's great. Very, very good stuff. I really appreciate it. Very helpful, very practical ways that we can go out and observe our land and start to implement some changes. But are there some practical steps or ways that you would recommend people getting started? I think the education piece is a big part of it, but what are some of the things that you usually recommend people do as far as getting started? Alan, if you'd take that.
Yeah. So yes, definitely education. Okay. Beyond a shadow of a doubt. And again, we have our understandingag.com website is just absolutely packed full of resource materials for beginning that education. We've got reams of articles, we've got recommended reading, archived webinars, lots of podcasts, case studies, those types of things are all available. So start there. Then we have the online curriculum, the online courses. That's a great way for people to begin to understand the basics of regenerative agriculture, the 634, and how to appropriately apply them within their context. And then from there, an in-person school. So attend a Soil Health Academy. They're intensive, hands-on schools that allow you to be able to really get a good grasp of how to do this and how to recognize and observe what you need to be observing. But the other thing that the schools do for you, the academies, is that it allows you to be around other farmers and ranchers that are on this journey as well. And they not only learn from us, they learn from each other. And we heavily encourage them to form a network among each other so that once they leave the academy, they are each other's peers and mentors, to be able to work with each other. And then another thing that you definitely need to do, get off of your farm or ranch, occasionally. Go visit other farms and ranches that are implementing these regenerative principles and see what they're doing. Talk to them. That's probably honestly one of the things that benefits us as consultants so much, is that we are literally on hundreds of farms and ranches every single year. And I promise you, we're soaking it up. We're learning, even though we're there to teach them. You know what? We are learning ourselves as we're doing that because of what we're seeing on each of these operations. So never downplay that. And unfortunately, too many farmers and ranchers don't take the time to go visit other farms and ranches. So in my mind, those are several of the most critical things. Gabe?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Alan. I would just say, there's an old adage, you're the culmination of your 5 closest friends. Well, when Alan talks about getting off your farm or ranch, one of the true joys of regenerative agriculture is that those who are involved with it are truly want to help each other, and they're willing to share and they're willing to talk. So wrapping it up, I would just say that your farm, your ranch is a direct reflection of you and your stewardship of that farm or ranch. Make it what you want it to be.
Yeah. And I think that it's really tempting for me to go to the Soil Health Academy at Gabe's place because I can drive there. But it's probably more beneficial for me to go to the Soil Health Academy at Alan's place because it might as well be the moon coming from Western South Dakota. It's totally different than my place. And so it's an opportunity to see new country and see it from a different perspective.
Yeah. You'll have a time with the language though down there, Clay.
Very good. Well, you guys,
we speak perfect Mississippian and Alabamian. So, hey.
Very good. Well, you guys, I really appreciate your time today, and I look forward to the rest of this relationship and more podcasts to come.
Thank you, Clay.
Thank you, Clay. Very much appreciate it.
Very good stuff there with them, as always. Really appreciate them taking the time to join me, and really look forward to future episodes with the Understanding Ag crew. So make sure you're subscribed so you're getting these Friday episodes when they come out. And we'll be back again on Monday with another episode. I think I'll be sharing with you a talk that I recently gave to a group of FFA students about the having a story worth telling. What is a story worth telling, and how should we communicate our story as far as it relates to agriculture with the watching world, so to speak. So we'll see you again real soon with another episode of the Working Cows Podcast.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.